Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second to final talk in our winter seat, Eleanor Hooker Winter Tea Talks by the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail in the Seacoast African American Cultural Center. It is with unspeakable pleasure that I introduce our speaker for today, because without her work and the work of other dedicated souls like Valerie Cunningham, we wouldn't even have a Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail. So we are forever indebted to Ms. Cunningham for the work she has done in raising awareness for not only Portsmouth's Black heritage, but also New Hampshire's Black heritage. New Hampshire is often spoke about as one of the whitest states in the Union. So whenever we discover these little known stories of Black history, it changes the landscape of a colonial New England town to be much more complex, much more inclusive, and much more diverse than we normally think of New Hampshire as being. So with Valerie's talk today, she will actually, our lectures before have been very historical, history-centered, and Valerie's talk today will bring us more current history. And as this year will represent the 50th anniversary, 50th. I'm mixing them up now, two different.
You're stealing my speech.
Okay, let me shut up. I introduce you to Valerie Cunningham. Thanks, Valerie.
I didn't know that Jerry Ann was going to be here, although I should have known she would be. Jerry Ann is dynamo, as most of you already know. So, again, welcome to Discover Portsmouth. The Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail is part of the Portsmouth Historical Society, whose mission is to tell Portsmouth stories. New Hampshire's Black Heritage Trail began in this seaport more than 350 years ago. But to explain the stories of the African diaspora often leads us to points beyond. And so we welcome you to the 7th in the series of 8 Eleanor Williams Hooker Winter Tea Talks. And I'll take this opportunity to personally thank a longtime friend of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail who has not only supported these extraordinarily successful tea talks, but also for making it possible to record and preserve the tea talks to share with an even wider audience. Former director of the New Hampshire Division of Welfare, Mr. Thomas Hooker. This year, the Seacoast African American Cultural Center was a partner in presenting the Winter Tea Talks. The Cultural Center is now open for the season, and they welcome you to visit their exhibits downstairs. What are the hours, Jerry?
Right now, they're from 1 to 4 in the afternoon, Monday through Saturday.
Monday through Saturday in the afternoon from 1 to 4.
And Saturday from 10
to 4 on Saturday. So there's always something interesting and exciting going on there. In addition to the exhibits, they also have lots of special programs. 2 weeks from today, local author Patricia Wall will be presenting the 8th and final tea talk for this season. She'll be sharing some of the fascinating research she's doing on colonial slavery in Kittery and southern Maine. Is that right? Kittery and southern Maine? Stand up and make yourself known. And that will be on the 27th of April at 2 o'clock in this room. If you aren't familiar with Pat's work, Please take a look at her books in the gift shop after today's program. Please take a look at her books in the gift shop after today's program. So, by now I guess you know I'm Valerie Cunningham, and I was the former director of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail. And by now you also know that Jerry Ann Bogus has been the director for more than 3 years. In her absence today, I was going to say, she asked me to remind you of our annual spring symposium, which will be here in this room on May 3rd. And you should have, where is Jerry? Do we have cards for everyone?
Yeah, we pass them out.
Okay. And it's a good thing I noted my pages. Let's see. Yeah, so we need you to register online at portsmouthhistory.org or by phone by calling Discover Portsmouth so that we have a head count for lunch. It's very important. And also because obviously our seating is limited. So if you register ahead of time, you will have guaranteed seating. I'm also delighted to introduce Colleen Riley, who has been interning with the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail since last October, and she'll be presenting with me today. Colleen is a senior at the University of New Hampshire, graduating in May with a Bachelor of the Arts in History with minors in Spanish and Race and Ethnic Studies. A majority of her academic work at UNH has focused on the importance of race, identity, and language in historical and political contexts. She's actively involved in several student organizations focused on social justice and diversity. And among many other things, she also volunteers her time at a local, how do you have any extra time? She volunteers at a local elementary school in the ESL classroom. So please welcome Ms. Colleen Riley.
Like you didn't say anything yet.
The title of our tea talk today is New Hampshire's Battle for Civil Rights, a 50-year retrospective. This talk will outline local events in the years leading up to the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. I hope you caught that in the description. And some of the city's most courageous citizens will be discussed later on. Many of you in this room are already aware of the national political context in which the 1964 Civil Rights Law was signed by President Lyndon Johnson. There has been much coverage of this 50th anniversary on NPR and television, and even in a recent Hollywood movie. But as always, when thinking about the civil rights movement, little or no attention is given to activities in the North, or especially not northern New England. So, before I jump into it, I was, as usual, doing one of my timelines, trying to remember myself, and I'll ask you to go back with me and remember what was happening in 1963. Many of us here have been reminded that the submarine Thresher sank in 1963. Average cost of a new house that year was, who knows?
$7,000.
How about 12?
Really? In 1960, my folks built one for $7,000, but they did a lot of the work themselves.
Well, we built one for, bought one for 10, but we were poor.
Well, we were.
So the average cost was 12. I know at the time we bought our little house, we had looked at some $20,000 houses,
Really?
and I thought, oh my God, who would ever be able to afford that? A loaf of bread was 22 cents. The average cost of a new car was $3,000. Gas per gallon was 29 cents.
Oh, wow.
Studebaker cars went out of production that year. Mattel, the toy maker, had a Gorilla Poncho gun set for $3.58. It included a camouflage 50-shot machine gun that fired bursts or single shots. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was held on August 25th. And one person was there. Anybody else in this room? Stand up, Pat. She was there. 2 weeks later, after the March on Washington, the KKK bombed a Birmingham church, killing 4 children. The first state lottery in the United States was held in New Hampshire. Beatlemania had begun with I Want to Hold Your Hand before their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show the next year. In 1963, the year-end close of Dow Jones average was 762. And, of course, President John Kennedy was assassinated. So, audience, what else can you add to the list, the timeline? Not you. My son has a
certain connection.
A certain connection to that year.
Born
Any other additions? Well, let me go on then to help explain why the 1964 Civil Rights Law was so important. I decided to share some excerpts from a report written in January of 1964 to the New Hampshire Advisory Committee. It was written by the New Hampshire Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. This is a remarkable document for the historical timeline that it covers and for what it unsubconsciously reveals about the pre-civil rights era. Again, what I will read is excerpts from the preamble of a detailed report of the Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in January 1964. I have omitted some parts and edited others for the sake of brevity and to emphasize that the references are to events that occurred in the past, in the years leading up to, not after, the Civil Rights Law was passed. So when I finish reading this section, Colleen will share her research on civil rights activities during the 1960s in New Hampshire State University in Durham. Then we'll welcome your questions, your comments, your personal stories. So again, all of the following comes from the report of the Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights dated January 1964. And it begins. New ground was broken in the field of civil rights by the New Hampshire Advisory Committee between May 1962 and May 1963. Situations in which Americans were denied equal treatment in this state because of race were publicly aired for the first time. The Advisory Committee functioned both as an educational force and as a symbol. It disseminated specific information on civil rights problems, and in doing so, symbolically reflected the concern which the question of civil rights is evoking in private citizens. The committee was also aware of its historical antecedents in the state as a part of the continuing process to advance constitutional safeguards to all Americans. This process has occupied many pages of this state's history, from its colonial beginning until the present day. Again, this is 1964. The ancient dialogue has been in existence in New Hampshire from the founding of the state. To give historical continuity to this report, a brief sketch of this history is included. There are two connecting threads which run through the fabric of the early history of New Hampshire. Both are pertinent to this examination. First is the slavery question, and the other is the anti-foreign and anti-Catholic attitudes. Both were present when New Hampshire became one of the 13 original states. This is my words. The report continues with a lengthy description of pro-slavery and abolitionist speeches. I'll skip that to say this. Numerous newspaper advertisements for the return of runaway slaves in all parts of colonial New Hampshire attest to the defiance of enslaved Africans and African Americans. The struggle against enslavement was taken to the New Hampshire legislature in 1779 by 20 African men living in Portsmouth and enslaved since they were children. They petitioned the legislature for their freedom and to end the practice of human bondage, in their words, so that the name of slave may not more be heard in the land. But the petition was tabled, and the enslavement of black people in New Hampshire continued for another half century. Now back to the committee report. In 1781, New Hampshire was drawing up its state constitution against a backdrop of a long history of anti-Catholic sentiment. Some of the sentiment was imported from England, some grew from the French-Indian Wars, and some of it was nurtured here at home. Into the Constitution, then, went a requirement that persons aspiring to state office must be Protestants. There were only scattered objections. These two topics, slavery and Catholicism, were to occupy the state with varying degrees of intensity until the mid-1800s, when the nativist movement was in its ascendancy. Anti-Catholic riots broke out in major cities. In Manchester, a mob damaged a Catholic church, and Catholic clergymen were forced to flee for safety. It was not until 1876 that the religious restrictions on office holders were finally removed from the New Hampshire State Constitution. The continuing immigration of foreign elements, as they called it, into the state, French Canadian, Irish, Polish, Greek, and Lithuanian, mostly Catholic, caused social strains. These struggles to find a place in the society eventually merged with the great labor struggles that carried over into the 20th century across the country. The Palmer raids of the 1920s involved municipal authorities, sometimes the state militia, and on at least one occasion, federal authorities, ostensibly against subversion. They targeted foreign-born workers. One of the biggest raids was conducted in Nashua, when 160 persons, including 23 women, were arrested. Some were deported. The 1920s also saw a spirited revival of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was able to attract a number of adherents in cities and towns across New England, including well-advertised rallies in Portsmouth and the purchase of a mansion in Rochester for the use as state headquarters. Some of you may remember other waves of visibility by the Klan. I know some of you were here in the 1990s when they were very busy in parading in full regalia in Newfields, Exeter, and Portsmouth, and Durham, sticking their calling cards in the books in the library at the University of New Hampshire. So anyway, some of the members of this advisory committee, by the way, the names of the advisory committee are on the sheet that you should have picked up on your chair. Some of the members of this advisory committee recalled fiery crosses on New Hampshire hillsides. As late as 1960, the hotel owners' political lobby in New Hampshire had stoutly resisted any proposed legislation to prohibit discriminatory practices in places of public accommodation, claiming that to allow as guests Jews, persons of Southern Mediterranean descent, or non-whites, would be detrimental to their business. An investigation by the advisory committee showed discrimination in more than half of the state's hotels, motels, and summer resorts. The findings jarred the legislature into action. In 1960, the General Court passed a law forbidding discrimination in public accommodations on grounds of race, religion, and national origin. So, take a sip. Don't laugh at me. The main work of the advisory committee in 1962 and 1963 consisted of public meetings in two of the state's largest cities. Nashua, at that time, with a population of 41,000, and Portsmouth, with a population of 27,000. By the way, the current population of Portsmouth, I think, is somewhere around 20,000. So in 64, it was 27,000, which sounds like a lot, but it got even bigger than that. I think it went up to about 35,000 by the 80s, before the P's closed. The situation in Portsmouth was heightened by the presence of a large Air Force base. The committee's report included examples of discriminatory practices in local housing and public accommodation, references to the attitudes of the state's major newspaper attitudes, and statements from some of the reverse freedom riders. We will hand out copies of a couple of those examples later. The public meeting in Nashua was on November 20th, 1962. It constituted the first public discussion of the race problem in that city. There were about 135 Negroes in Nashua, less than half of 1% of the population. That was the race problem. The 1960 census listed 1,903 Negroes in the entire state. 25 Negro residents of Nashua submitted statements to the committee. All but 2 of those were related to discrimination when attempting to buy or rent housing. The 2 exceptions were recent arrivals, reverse freedom riders from New Orleans. They told of discrimination in a local restaurant. Who knows what reverse freedom riders were? So we'll talk about that later. The committee felt that the sampling showed a widespread pattern of discrimination in housing against Negroes, and that this discrimination was long established. Negroes had come to Nashua in numbers during the 1920s, when they were brought up from the South by a wood treating plant, which manufactures railroad ties. The plant constructed shanties for the workers next to the plant on the outskirts of town. During the 1950s, there was also a slow immigration of Negroes, including engineers and professional men, in the electronics plants, which replaced the cotton mills. There's some irony here that we can discuss later, too. 3/4 of the small Negro population was confined to one section of the city that the Housing Authority chairman said was in a state of advanced decay and dilapidation. It was slated to be torn down for an urban renewal project. This is sounding very familiar, isn't it? Negroes living in this area included those workers who had to move out of the company-provided shanties when those were condemned by the city. Others living there were those workers' descendants or newcomers to the city. Most had tried to move from the area, but their efforts were blocked by landlords who refused to rent to them on racial grounds. One witness testified that he set aside money for a down payment on a house. Blocked in his efforts to buy a house, the family finally bought a new car. In one case, The state's attorney general was solicited by a fair housing group to help a Negro engineer successfully get into an apartment. No Negroes had been accepted into Nashua's federally sponsored 100-unit low-rent public housing project. In Portsmouth, the public meeting was held on April 16, 1963. This public housing authority was established in 1959 and was the first in the state to sign an open housing agreement. Since that time, 32 Negro families had lived in the city's public housing project at one time or another. Portsmouth had the largest number of Negroes in the state, about 1,200. The Air Force Base accounted for most of that number, although less than half lived off the base. The majority of Negro civilians working at the majority of Negro civilians, not at the air base, worked at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and those who were willing and able to buy a house encountered far fewer problems in Portsmouth than those seeking rental properties. Generally, a Negro with money and perseverance could buy a house in Portsmouth. And with a couple exceptions, the Negro population was more integrated in Portsmouth than it was in Nashua. This did not minimize the race problem. The Advisory Commission reported and noted that Portsmouth's chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People showed in its housing survey that there was less than 3% acceptance of Negroes. Prior to November 1962, the Air Force Base Housing Office accepted listings from area landlords that specified white only. After protests from the NAACP and a meeting of local Negro leaders and the base commanding general, such designations were removed. As a result of discriminatory policies, official and tacit, an area of Portsmouth known as Wentworth Acres contained most of the Negroes living in the city. That area might be more familiar to some of you as Mariners Village, or in its most recent incarnation as Osprey Landing. Wentworth Acres was an 800-unit housing development erected by the government for naval shipyard war workers during World War II, and it was later turned over to a private landlord. Witnesses at the meeting said that the acres had been allowed to run down. They had sketchy municipal services and police protection and unwholesome environmental conditions. There's a whole lot more to that story, but we won't go there now. Mostly, however, they complained that they were unable to move out. A civilian supervisor at the airbase said that he was financially able to live in a better place, but he could not because he was not allowed to. One housewife told of a dozen refusals based on racial grounds. When she tried to find a house, she gave up and settled on living at Wentworth Acres. Another witness who complained about housing was a Negro Baptist minister. He finally found a place when he was helped by the Unitarian Universalist Church in Portsmouth. The committee concluded that non-whites had a difficult time finding suitable housing despite a state law which prohibits discrimination in multi-dwelling housing. That's the 1960 New Hampshire law. Buying was less a problem, but even then, Negroes would have a better chance if they could find a private sale that did not involve realtors, because they were redlining. You know what redlining is. So here are the conclusions and recommendations on housing by the Advisory Committee in 1964. The extreme difficulty that non-whites encounter in their search for adequate housing forces most of them to live in dilapidated areas. Negroes in New Hampshire who have managed to escape from these rundown areas have generally been aided by whites or other Negroes already settled, by poor housing practices groups, or by members of the clergy. It would seem that if the state were able to provide more help in the way of legal assistance, to persons who have been discriminated against in housing, the 1960 state law would be more effective. At present, the person discriminated against must fight his case through the municipal courts. This is a long, involved process and is often hopeless. So I hope this has raised some questions and that you will add your own stories to this. But now we're going to hear from Colleen. She's been doing some research at UNH.
Get confused. Okay, so as Valerie said, I'm Colleen Riley, and so I'd like to begin with thanking Jerianne and Valerie for granting me the opportunity to work with the Ports of Black Heritage Trail this year. You both inspire me through your scholarship and your passion for the integral work you do in the community to create a more holistic and realistic history of our state. And I've learned so much from working with the Ports of Black Heritage Trail, and it's only furthered my interest and passion for social justice and the discipline of history. And so as Valerie said, I'm a student at the University of New Hampshire, so I wanted to use this opportunity to learn more about the history of my university within the context of a major national event, namely the Civil Rights Movement. Planted in the collective memory of public memory of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s more generally is the idea of radical student activism among masses of young people, both black and white. And so during my research, I wanted to explore how accurate this portrayal of campus activism and involvement was at UNH, as well as explore conversations about race, and more particularly racism and discrimination on this campus, especially because the university was and remains to be at the current time a predominantly white institution. And so I hope to gain a better understanding of the university through a historical context, and I want to share the stories to create a more realistic and holistic view of the university climate with regard to race as well as student activism. And so for sources, I primarily use the Granite, which is the annual student yearbook, and the New Hampshire, which is the weekly student published newspaper. And the scope of my research and the sources I utilize date from 1960 to 1969. And my primary goal in exploring these particular sources was to hear these stories from the students themselves to give them a sense of voice and authenticity. And so my research had two primary goals. The first question I posed was, in what ways did racism and discrimination occur at UNH, and what was the dialogue around these particular issues on campus? And as I will discuss, the particular type of racism and discrimination that occurred at UNH and in the North more generally is very different than the overt acts of violence and subjugation that occurred in the South, which is predominantly the focus of discourse of the civil rights movement and public collective memory. And that's not to say that incidents of institutionalized racism as well as individual prejudice did not occur at UNH and in the North. In fact, it's quite the opposite, and I'm going to discuss that. And as a second point of inquiry, I wanted to explore the student groups and forms of activism that did occur on the UNH campus and in the community at large. And so one quote I found that I feel sums up the prevailing reality of student activism on the UNH campus, and it's from the 1967 edition of the Granite, which again is the student yearbook. And the quote reads as such, every university community is made up of a large body of apathetic degree chasers revolving around a small group of hardcore activists who care enough to give the very best. And that being said, I explored the impact of a few student groups on campus, namely the African Student Union and the UNH Civil Rights Committee. And so I'll outline the experiences of these particular groups on campus and put them into the overall context of life at UNH in the 60s. And so as stated previously, I will first discuss a few instances of discrimination and racism on the UNH campus in the 60s. The first example I have comes from an article in the New Hampshire dated May 14th, 1964. This article discusses the discriminatory clauses in two of the fraternities on campus. Alpha Tau Omega, also known as ATO, and Lambda Chi were the two fraternities on campus that still had a white Christian clause in their membership handbooks. Therefore, males who were either not white or not Christian were discriminated against in the process of rushing a fraternity. These discriminatory clauses caused one of the student journalists to pursue definitions of discrimination by UNH students and faculty. This controversy precipitated a conversation on campus which asked students and faculty to question whether or not there was discrimination based on race, religion, or ethnicity, whether it existed in their hegemonic community. And this particular conversation was precipitated by a Jewish student's desire to take part in the rushing process of ATO, but when members of the fraternity found out about his religious and ethnic background, they were no longer interested in him. And so the student journalist went on to ask other students what they thought about the situation and whether or not they believed that UNH should establish an all-Jewish fraternity on campus. One Jewish student stated that with such a small percentage of Jewish students on campus, there wouldn't be enough support for such a group, and even if there was, he would not want to put himself in what would amount to be a ghetto on campus. And he claimed that it would be like having an all-Negro fraternity on campus, and there simply wouldn't be enough need for such a brotherhood on campus, either an all-Jewish fraternity or an all-Black fraternity. And in the case of the fraternity ATO, apparently an exploration of a candidate's religious background during rush did not exist until that year, and which caused students on campus to question the seriousness of the discriminatory clauses. And the students interviewed also claimed that they did not believe that a Negro had ever attempted to rush any fraternity, not just ATO in particular. The members of ATO that were interviewed claimed it would be impossible for a Negro in particular to rush their fraternity, not just because of the overt discriminatory clause, but also because even though a majority of the brothers in the fraternity were not prejudiced, enough individuals in the organization were prejudiced, and therefore the students simply would not be accepted for initiation into the fraternity. And so ATO also claimed to be concerned about the reputation and approval of allowing a Negro into their organization because the fraternity was started in the South, and therefore Southern universities had more power within their organization. So even if the University of New Hampshire chapter wanted to change their particular policy, they would not be able to because in their opinion they were outnumbered by the Southerners in their national organization. And this begs the question of the privileged status of the individuals within this particular fraternity, because they in fact are reaping the benefits of membership of this organization, knowing full well that it's actively discriminating against others because of their race, ethnicity, or religious background. And so the story of discriminatory clauses in fraternities speaks to the institutionalized and systemic racism and discrimination on campus, but there's also instances of racism occurring on the individual level. On December 17th, 1964, An article was published by an anonymous white female student. She claimed that she dated a Negro on campus, and during the course of her romantic involvement with this particular individual, the reality of the racist world that she lived in became tangible in a way that previously was foreign to her. And so the young woman claimed that the other young women in her dormitory, as well as her house mother, were less than friendly and supportive of her relationship. And she said that her house mother did not approve of her relationship and repeatedly said disagreeable, insulting remarks to the young woman. And she asserted that she just felt like people didn't like her anymore, and they stared at the couple when they were together in public. And she said these stares weren't friendly or curious, they were of amazement, hostility, and anger. And she asked her then boyfriend how he deals with this type of treatment day in and day out. He responded by saying, you learn patience, and you learn not to notice. She said that through this experience, she learned a little about how it is to be Black and that it wasn't very much fun. And though this article is written from the privileged perspective of the white woman, I think it sheds light on the particular brand of racism that occurred and still occurs in the North and on the UNH campus in particular. Until this woman was put into the situation of learning and maintaining a close relationship with a Black person, she could not tangibly understand the stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination that went along with that identity. And so this article sheds light on the fact that racism, bias, and outright anger did exist on the UNH campus when the average white student was encountered by a person of another race. And so this type of subtle, concealed racism that occurred at UNH and in the North more generally is discussed in an article from the following month on January 14th, 1965. And the article began with the statement, "Racial prejudice at the University of New Hampshire, how silly." This article aimed to dispel the myth by actually interviewing Black and African students on campus about their experiences on the predominantly white campus, rather than just appealing to the white masses who wanted to believe that racism and discrimination did not exist on their campus. One Black student said that racial discrimination and prejudice definitely existed on campus given his experiences, claiming that it was not the naked, open prejudice that you see in the South, but in the North it's hidden behind phony smiles, but he felt it every day. And another Black male claimed that he believed he would be fine on campus, so as long as he did not try to date white girls on campus because the white boys didn't like it. And he illustrated a particular incident in which he and his roommate invited two white females over for dinner, and the manager of his apartment house called the police on them. And another Black student claimed that professors were just as bad, asserting that if they asked for extra help outside of the classroom, they would be blatantly ignored by their teachers. And these Black students expressed fear of speaking out because they did not want to stir things out and cause a controversy on campus, because in their eyes there were so few students and faculty that would support them. And they said that everyone wanted to believe that everything was so beautiful here, and in their experience things weren't very beautiful because of the silent, subtle daily prejudice and ignorance they were subjected to on the UNH campus. And so, however, despite the ongoing climate of ignorance on campus, there were pockets of hope in the form of student organizations that gave students a place to express themselves and to work to educate the community. And so one such group, as I said, was the African Student Union. And in the 1967 edition of the Granite, the African Student Union described its vision as such: following the lead of their relatives at home, the Africans at UNH have broken away from the Europeans and asserted themselves as a separate entity. And their primary goal as a university organization was attempting to interest the population at large in the various cultures which they represent. The organization claimed that this was incredibly difficult because New Hampshire's population of Americans of African descent is minuscule, with a population of 2,000, of which perhaps 5 lived above Concord. Despite this, the African Student Union did rise to some level of public knowledge and consciousness on the campus during the 1966-1967 school year, when one of their members, a student named Steve Benoa from Ghana, landed in a local hospital with a severe kidney infection, and during this time, the African Student Union was able to mobilize other student groups on campus as well as individual students on campus to raise money to help pay Benoa's medical bills. And so, as I stated at the beginning of my talk, the prevailing account of the 1960s in American collective memory is that of radical student activism on college campuses and at the community at large. In my research, I've come to the conclusion that a majority of the campus population was not aggressively involved in activism, particularly regarding the civil rights movement, but there was a collective of students who were interested in educating themselves and engaging in trainings and dialogues about civil rights issues. In October of 1963, 70 students from the university participated in a training by Emerson Reed of the Portsmouth NAACP, and Reed called these students to action after critiquing the New Hampshire senators and representatives, stating that these New Hampshire elected officials were not interested and engaged in the issues of national civil rights. And to these students, he stressed the importance of promoting civil rights at the national level, but with a particular emphasis on maintaining and gaining civil liberties for Negroes in the state of New Hampshire. And so congruent with Reed's call to action was a nonviolence training attended by 100 students in the late spring of 1964. And the training was run by 3 students from the Virginia Union University. And in the training, the UNH students learned the tenets of nonviolent protest, such as how one looks when they're physically knocked down on the ground and the importance of getting up, attempting to get up with a smile on your face. And while they learned that nonviolence is a tactic that relies on passiveness and submissiveness, they were also trained in active defense techniques. And they learned the basic philosophy of nonviolent protest, which is to keep your fellow protesters safe and to have a plan set in place for the whole group. And so during the summer of 1964, at least one UNH student utilized the preparation they received during the nonviolence training. Ellen Seigel, a UNH sophomore at the time, participated in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, Freedom Summer, to work as an educator and promote voter registration in Mississippi. And so during the summer, Seigel was arrested for obstructing a sidewalk during a SNCC demonstration and subsequently spent 2 days in a Mississippi jail. And she wrote to her parents for bail money, as well as writing to a few of her friends at UNH who sent her money as well. And after the jail expenses were paid, she donated the remainder of the funds to SNCC to further their cause. And so following her return to UNH in the fall, Seigel played an integral role in the establishment of the UNH Civil Rights Committee, and the group had its first meeting in October of 1964 and included students who were interested in all phases and parts of civil rights work, meaning that those who were actively interested in furthering civil rights, as well as those students who wanted to learn more. And so the UNH Civil Rights Committee focused on education, charity, research, and bringing speakers to the school. They also spoke out in the student newspaper about civil rights infringements occurring at the national level, as well as the importance of an emphasis on personal liberties within the state of New Hampshire. And Seigel in particular was quite outspoken, writing several letters to the editor, one focused on a petition to President Lyndon B. Johnson to enforce school desegregation in Mississippi, and another focused on a civil rights display that was tampered with in the Memorial Union building on campus. And the UNH Civil Rights Committee also brought the Freedom Singers from SNCC to campus for a fundraising campaign and to raise awareness about civil rights infractions in the South. And so in conclusion, what I hope to illustrate to you all today is examples of the specific and subtle types of racism and discrimination that occurred during the 1960s, as well as shed light on the student organizations that aimed to create a more inclusive campus. And I think it's important to note that even though there were groups on campus, such as the African Student Union and the UNH Civil Rights Committee, that we're actively involved in educating the masses, it is imperative to also look at the passiveness of the majority of the student population. And so I think because of UNH's location in a small New Hampshire town, many of students felt disconnected from a lot of national issues that were occurring at the time, both in physical proximity and because they felt like the issues of racism and discrimination were irrelevant in their predominantly white world. And this project has caused me to question how much progress have we really made. According to a fall 2011 statistic, there were 957 multicultural, aka non-white students pursuing their bachelor's degree at UNH, of which only 161 identified as Black or African American. The numbers, of course, are not quite as low as they were in the 60s, but for minority students, particularly Black students, attending UNH can be a very daunting experience, plagued with a lot of the similar experiences of subtle discrimination and bias that I discussed in my research. Now we have many resources on campus to help multicultural students unite, such as the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, the UNH Connect program, the President's Commission on the Commission of Status of People of Color, and the Diversity Support Coalition. And even given these wonderful supportive resources on campus, incidents of bias and ignorance on the part of the white majority of students still make UNH a complicated and contradictory place when it comes to its emphasis on diversity. And so I ask, even though we have greater access to information and attitudes about race and discrimination, how much has really changed since the 1960s, and how much have we really overcome? Contradictory.
Complicated and contradictory. May I quote you?
Sure. Do you want the mic, or should I? Okay.
We have a statement here from Nina Jordan, who, would you like to read this?
Yeah. Nina's the head of legal redress for the NAACP. So she investigates current complaints. And got this very
All of this is being recorded for posterity.
okay. As Fred Ross has often said, okay, racism is alive and well in New Hampshire. Sad but true. New Hampshire NAACP continues to be called upon to address hate crimes in neighborhoods and the workplace, racial slurs and explicit discrimination in schools and other institutions. Currently, the NAACP is partnering with Boston's Department of Justice Community Resource Services and members of the Dover Quaker Peace and Social Concerns Committee to present cultural diversity programs. Programs such as these and programs conducted by the UNH Office of Multicultural Student Affairs are intended to educate people about our country's history of institutional racism. The purpose is to be proactive. All of us, particularly those in the white community, need to recognize our biases and be ready to acknowledge them. The next step is to actively communicate and dialogue with those we consider to be the other. Seacoast NAACP Legal Redress Committee. And the kinds of incidents that were brought up as of 40 years ago, 50 years ago, are current in complaints to the NAACP now. Things have not changed. It's hard to change people's minds and attitudes.
That was unrehearsed.
Look into that, like all the, because I was focused on the 60s in particular, but I
Let's see, what else do we have to do? Oh, I have to get my, let's see, is this, it might be finished. This is why I write everything down, because, well, this is, I was supposed to ask you this before we started, but I'll ask now, and then we can go into Q&A. I'm just curious about how many of you were living here in 1963 or had members of your family living here in 1963. So that accounts for
6 or 6.
that accounts for the most recent report from somebody in New Hampshire. I think it was the professor at UNH who does the political surveys and all of that analysis stuff. I think he said 70% of the population of New Hampshire is non-native. And politicians, especially local politicians, would be wise to keep that in mind when planning their future.
But he owns a truck.
So I think we could open, yes.
I'll do the Q&A.
Would you mind taking over now?
That doesn't mean you're not going to answer questions, right?
No, I'll answer questions. I just don't know what else to do.
So we're going to open the floor up to Q&A session. But I wanted to ask Colleen before she sat, did you do any research yet on the students sit-in for 10 years ago?
no, I haven't had a chance to look into that, like all the, because I was focused on the 60s in particular. If I branch off into more of this topic, but I went to the event last semester.
Could you just talk a little bit about that event?
Okay. So 10 years ago, a group of students from the Black Student Union on campus basically sat in on the president's office to, trying to think, to protest and to urge them to demand to create a more inclusive environment on campus with regard to diversity and just the sheer numbers of Black students and other minority students on campus. And so during this conversation last semester, it was 10 years later, and there wasn't really any large change. They implemented the UNH Connect program, which is basically when groups of students that are multicultural or or first generation college students, they get to move in early to campus and get to know each other. And so that was the only real thing that was implemented to change. And there has been a slight increase in Black students on campus, but not anything significant.
Well, I just wanted, I went to that event, and I'll just mention this real quick, because it was exactly what I think this country needs. The Black Student Union, the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, created this event on the 10th anniversary of the student protest. And the Black Student Union at that time were 7 students. They took over the president's office and demanded certain, they had a list of 40 requests that they wanted. And as Colleen said, those were meant, one of them having tenured staff. I think they wanted 30 tenured faculty in 10 years.
And now
I think
there's 8
there's
overall.
3 tenured.
But there's 8 that are on the tenure track, and 7 of them are in the College of Liberal Arts, and 1 is in Health and Human Services. So they're all, 3 of them are actually in the English department.
And I think wasn't one of the demands for a black psychologist?
For a psychologist, so that,
And they did get.
they
her,
had that
but
for
I
a
don't
while
know
and
how
then
long she-
not longer. But what I wanted to say about that event was, to me, it was the most moving and heartfelt event I have ever been on campus. The students who took part in that sit-in were invited to come back to talk about it. And so they were on stage. They were on stage and they were talking about their experience 10 years ago on campus. And you would have thought they were talking about experiences in the 1960s for what happened to them. But it was the kind of dialogue on race that I think the country needs. An open, honest, non-threatening, dialogue that gives you the human touch of what racism does to a person, to a people, to a nation. And it was an amazing moment for UNH to look at itself through the eyes of the students that were discriminated against, right in their own campus.
And it was packed.
And it was totally packed. The president was there. So it was, and people got to dialogue. The professors, the students, the community. It was a total dialogue on race, which if this country really, really needs, I think. You know, South Africa had their reconciliation. You know, we had our, Rwanda had their reconciliation. Anything that damages a country so much, people do need to face and look at. And I'm preaching. I feel like, let me stop. Any questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, what were your sources? First of all, I want to commend you on a very, well thought out, articulate, informative research. You remind me of my college roommate. You really do. She's very academic like you and big on civil rights. And I'd like to introduce you to her at some point so you guys can exchange information. But what were your sources?
I primarily used, I don't know if my mic's on. I primarily used the Granite, which is the student yearbook, and then the New Hampshire, which is the student newspaper. And so I also used some demographic, like sheets, I guess, they were mostly from the registrar they were published on the UNH library page, so if you wanted to look at them, they're on there. So those were my main sources.
And those sources are at the UNH library, Government Library.
Some of them are online that you can access them publicly, but some of them are in the special collections, which is in the library in Diamond.
And what about newspapers that covered university events?
Yeah, I looked at those a little bit, but I focused, because I wanted to focus on the student voice. So I read those, but for my particular focus, I wanted to focus on their stories from their perspective.
I live not too far from the university campus, but I find that I don't go because there's no place to park. And I wonder if we really are going to have a dialogue, if we don't need to have it in things like this, where you may be able to park, may be able to get there.
Location. It's a big issue, and I totally understand that. But I've found that this kind of dialogue on race happens real honestly in smaller groups where people feel more comfortable and able to say what they want to. So we got to go with what we have.
Well, I think this is the way to go.
Yes.
But the fact that a lot of people won't go to the university because they don't want to park, that's one thing. And another thing is they won't go to the university because they really don't like to go to the university. They talk down to them, they claim, or they fear, and they want to keep away. And if
That's
you
an
have-
image problem, huh?
It's a real problem to try to get two people. As I say, groups like this have a much better chance, I would think.
Thank you.
That's one advantage of having this recorded too, though we can share with other groups. Even though we can't have the dialogue, at least it can help them start to think.
I just wondered in your research if you found any professors or teachers at UNH in the 60s who stood up and took leadership.
Yeah, actually, there was one professor. He was the professor of political science that he was the UNH advisor for the UNH Civil Rights Committee, and there was another organization. I can't remember I'm blanking on the professor's name, but he was also a political science professor, and he was part of a group called SCORE, which was working on education equality for low-income students in Manchester and in the Seacoast region. So those were the only real professor involvement things that I found, but that doesn't mean that there necessarily wasn't.
Was that Hugh Potter?
No, I can't remember his name.
Valerie, do you know?
No, I was thinking it might have been, I know Hugh Potter was one of the professors at UNH. I don't know what department he was in. Do you know, Lorraine? Well, anyway, Hugh Potter was very active with the NAACP when they were doing the test cases after '64. In fact, Hugh Potter and his wife were the white couple who accompanied Jane and Emerson Reed, the black couple, when they went to integrate Wentworth by the Sea on the 4th of July in 1964. That was the first test case after the Civil Rights Law was passed. So, and Hugh Potter, he was also involved in some of the barbershop cases where, the black guy would go to the barbershop and say, will you cut my hair? They'd say no, then because I don't have time, or my white customers won't like it. So Hugh Potter would say, I'm a white customer and I don't mind at all. And so,
Gwen Daggett. Was Gwen Daggett involved?
Oh,
I don't know.
I know he was reviled by the Manchester Union leader.
oh, well.
That's easy.
Oh,
Well, there's a couple things, I was gonna just, there's a couple things that Valerie brought up that I just wanted to ask and see you first. There's two, one, before I come to that, I just want you to think about this. Why do we think racism and this divide is still prevalent and used as a tool in our country? Just think about that first before you answer now. But who knows about the reverse freedom fighters? Writers. Do you want to share what you know?
Well, I wasn't involved directly myself. I'm Tom Hooker. I was not involved directly myself, except the fact that I was aware of a lot of the college students who did the sit-ins at the 5 and 10 store, Woolworths, and also when they started riding the buses. And also, I think from the standpoint of the group, they're mostly youngsters who really felt devoted to the idea that they wanted to do something different, and they did something different. without any fear, and it was amazing. Matter of fact, one of the things I did, I have a recording of one of the events they were involved in, which I'd like to share sometime with someone.
Could you tell us? No, I was born in 1960, so and raised here in New Hampshire, so I don't have a lot of exposure to what you're discussing. Are these events that happened in the 60s, and where did they take place?
They mostly.
Define what you're talking about.
Yeah, actually, one second, let me just, so, because we were talking about the freedom riders, and then there is the reverse freedom riders. So there are two things going on right here. The freedom riders was an effort by groups in the North to go to the South. I hate being North and South because it makes things so easy, and our history of race and stuff is not as easy as saying North and South. But the Freedom Riders would go, help out in the 60s to go down and get the Southerners registered to vote. So there was buses that would leave from cities in the North and go to the areas where there was the most discrimination and racist practices going on. Yeah, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on. And there was also cases where I guess it came to the public's attention when one of the buses that was filled with white freedom riders was bombed and they disappeared. So that brought that movement to the attention of the American public. Reverse freedom riders is interesting.
And that's the handout that they just got.
Yeah, reverse freedom riders, and this was an effort by the southern states to get rid of their agitators. So people of color who were working, they call them agitators, but they were working to get people to the booths to vote, registered to vote in their neighborhood, were labeled as agitators or people they didn't want. And what they would do is actually put them in buses, get them out of their neighborhoods, get them out of their, kidnap them, put them in buses, and send the buses north. And they were, it was a way of the South then to say that you're sending your folks down to us, we'll send you our folks and see how you like it. And actually, New Hampshire, the then governor, what is his name?
Thompson.
Governor Thompson.
Who's no relation to me.
Don't claim him, that's okay. There was a big article in the Union Leader that said that those buses will not be allowed to come in the state of New Hampshire. They would be stopped at the border. And, you know, so there was a big article on that. And people did come from the South. My mother-in-law, she had, I don't know what organization really, they came to Manchester, but lots of the buses would come to Manchester and they would find homes for these people in New Hampshire.
Some of them went to the base,
some would go to the air base, some would go to different people's homes, because really they had no place to go because they were thrown out of their towns. And so that was part of, that was called the reverse freedom riders.
So how often did that take place? Was it like a few buses, or was it hundreds of buses over years?
No, it wasn't hundreds of buses, because remember, it was Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. The buses would go wherever, you know, wherever their end spot was. And the people that they put on the bus had no money, no connections to people. So if they came to New Hampshire and they were lucky enough to have relatives in Massachusetts, then they would end up in Massachusetts. So it was, you know, very mobile, and some people, they had no place to stay, would end up here. So.
But what were they recruiting them to do? When the White Citizens Council was enlisting the black youth from the South, what was
but they were not recruited for anything. they were booted out of their town. They were physically kicked out of their town. So not all of them, but a lot of them. It was a way of getting your agitators somewhere else.
And I think part of it was, I mean, there probably were different reasons, like there are always are different reasons for things happening. And if you will look, when you have a chance, read the handout, that second handout that we gave you, and that will give you one version of it, which is that in some places like Louisiana, New Orleans, was just the one that I referred to, and some other places, the White Citizens Council would advertise in the paper and on TV saying, if you would like to black people, if you would like to go up north where they really want you and where they have jobs and housing for you, because look how much they love you, you know, you can see how they keep coming down here trying to help you. So go up there and live there. So, you know, what was the motivation for that? Was it because they wanted these black people to get help, or was it because they wanted to embarrass those people up north who kept talking about how bad it was down south?
Yes.
So it wasn't their people, so to speak, that were racist down in those states, that were actually being sent up.
It was different in the handout.
Different places did different things, but it really was the way to get black, like Valerie says, embarrass the North. You're trying to embarrass us by sending down your white folks to have us vote. Well, we'll embarrass you here. Take these people and do what you want with them.
And in some cases, like one of the examples that you will see, this man had a pretty good job, but he kept getting fired because he was a so-called agitator. And so for his own survival, he chose to come up.
So why do we think this notion of racism, and we always hear it more at certain times than others, why does it continue to exist? If there's more visibility, there's more media, there's more tools for expression and for visibility, so we can't say you've never been exposed to a person of color or you don't know what's going on, but the attitude still exists.
I think in part, you mentioned more media, and as we begin to follow each other's thoughts given quite directly on the media, especially if they can be done anonymously under the handle of something like, you know, Old Truckee or Bulldog or something, that the undercurrent of hatred and anger has never stopped. And that all of the states that are currently passing laws to prevent people who are poor or aged or of color from voting in the coming election are all formerly Confederate states, all of them, except I think for Wisconsin. So something is geographically still happening to us. It relates back to our never having really stopped fighting the Civil War. And I think we need to see the continuity here. So I've been feeling very tense about the irony of celebrating the 50th anniversary of this Civil Rights Act. When I was in college, and very much part of who we were trying to do, as I see states being deliberately closing all toilet access on voting days in Florida, voted by the state legislature 2 days ago or so. Or in Texas, within 24 hours, the Supreme Court decision saying that certain southern states did not have to check with Washington before they changed anything. Within 24 hours, pre-arranged programs were already going in to change the voting districts to make some districts such that they'd be mostly people of color or mostly white and so on. That kind of, it just really scares me and makes me very sad. Above all, I want to say, I really think this is the sadness of it. There's so much viciousness online, and it just flows out like muck out of an outhouse.
I just wanted to point out that actually only within the last few years has New Hampshire been taken off the restricted list as far as being watched for voting rights violations by the feds. So we were not harmless or blameless in this. We were one of the states that stayed up until recently on this restricted list.
Yeah. And we're still on the watch list for the Southern Poverty Law Center for hate crimes.
Yeah, there's quite a few groups up here.
And anybody else? Because go ahead.
You know, I guess that that book, If You Disdain, you know, that book was a little more profound and deep. I just think that people would just like blacks to just disappear. We're a stain on our country's history, on our country's greatness, even though we're a part of that greatness. I think we are like the, you know, the children born of incest, basically, as a race of people whose background is so mixed because of our white ancestry, you know, our Indian heritage and our African heritage. I just think it messes everything up for everybody. It complicates everything. When you're in an all-white environment, there's just comfort. In an all-black environment, maybe like in the islands or something like that. I went down to Jamaica once. I felt the most comfortable than I've ever been in my own country. The same thing in Brazil, for that matter. I just think that likes like. You know, I've never understood how the British, you know, who presumably are all Anglo-Saxon. I mean, we know they're not. We know they're, you know, different nationalities, ethnicities now. But how even they could distinguish amongst themselves as people by segregating accents. What's up with that? What is it about human nature that we have to segregate one another? So if they do that amongst themselves, someone's from South London and someone's got another, you know, different accent. If they do that amongst themselves, how much more difficult for someone who doesn't look like them?
It's all political. It's, as long as you have people fighting with each other, then you don't notice somebody's picking your pocket. And so, you know, people in power want to keep these fights going, so we continue to fight each other and not take our government back.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think racism is a political strategy. For me, I think racism is used as a political strategy to keep people fighting against each other and keep that hatred going. And we see it especially now in the new set of code words that are used. You know, you'll just throw something out. You'll say inner cities. We don't, you know, we don't say ghetto. Who was it? Ron Paul. No. Ron Paul just said in an inner city where they have a history of generations of people who don't want to work. We don't come out and say, you know, blacks who don't want to work, but we use these things, and then, you know, another group listening to it will say, oh yeah, those people don't want to work. We sure don't want them to have food stamps.
Who was that
Over
doing all that?
Maine.
Picking all that cotton.
Let me go ahead.
Excuse me. Over in Maine, where I live, the current trend is welfare. You just say the word welfare, and you're talking about the many recent immigrants from various African countries. The governor of Maine is famous just using that word, welfare. I lived in a city in Maine. I had an injury and I couldn't work, so I was on the welfare, up in Lewiston, Maine. And at that time, and this would be 87, 88, 89, 90, I was there for several years with this injury, and I was on the
what they developed a workfare program where everyone had to go to the welfare office once a week. We had to sit in the hall of dignitaries, you know, under all the big photographs of the elected, revered political guys. And we all had to sit in these kind of chairs while the regular citizens of Lewiston, who were very nice people, would come in and do their business at City Hall. But the present governor came from the same town, Lewiston. And I've read articles about him. He was born into poverty. The present governor of Maine. And he obviously hates anyone who's poor, regardless of their color. But now he has a strategy, because there's so many recent immigrants from the African nations, political asylum people. He's trying to encourage them to be like reverse freedom riders and leave his city and leave the state of Maine. And I was on workfare, first time in my life. Our family never had to apply for any assistance by the grace of God, but we were poor. My father worked over at the National Gypsum plant, and we had a lot of, you know, layoffs and reduction in forces and stuff. And he was a union guy, so we were always the most unemployed. So I knew what, you know, being poor was about, but I never had to apply for, excuse me, I'm rambling, but I just want to say that the people of Lewiston who did have money treated us, the workfare people, with great dignity in those years. But now I've read in the recent newspaper articles, a new regime, and people aren't being treated well. And they use the word welfare. It's one of those things, as you mentioned.
I was just going to say to what you were saying, Jerry Ann, with the divide and conquer strategy, Edna Bonasich, who I believe is a sociologist, has had a theory for, I think, over 30 years, where they're talking about basically race and ethnic division is used as a tool of amplification to divide people so that they'll get cheaper labor. And a lot of it is done more just on a labor perspective, where if you've got different, like you were saying yourself, if you're talking about England and you've got, all right, we'll use different accents, and boy, it's been effective over there. I'm from another state, and a lot of the same issues, we're not talking about people coming in from Somalia or any place else. We're talking there about, you know, Spanish versus Mexican versus Anglo versus Native American. It's all the same issues, but what different groups, and it's just different regions using different groups, although there are some groups that have been used in a unified manner throughout the United States, obviously. But I think it goes back down to economics, just underlying everything.
I mean, if we were to close our eyes for a minute and think of these terms, and I'll just read, I mean, just for yourself, what image comes in your mind when you hear the term Cadillac driving welfare queen?
Oh, yeah. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan.
You know, or who do you see? You know, who is that person?
Yeah.
And when you associate the word food stamp president, you
Ronald
know,
Reagan.
you know, who does that? Lazy, dependent, and entitled 47 percenters.
That's an awful lot of people in that group.
So, you know, it's always a strategy to keep people away from the real issues of the day, you know? Exactly. When we have our majority of the people being, you know, on assistance and needing help. But if we can have you fighting against each other, you won't know that you're paying $4 a gallon for gas while all the profits go into Exxon.
That's right, 1%.
So.
Well, in other countries too, I used to live in Ireland, and a good chunk of the people, especially students, were on the dole. And it was not, the stigma was not the way it is here. It was quite a different situation, and it was considered just, you know, helping people out. And it was all groups, all ages, you know, all races. So,
Socialist. Yeah, the S word.
well, yes, it was a socialist country, I must say.
But that's what we do here, right? We have to put everything in a box and create the enemy of the socialist.
And we play George Orwell games. Socialist is a bad word, but in point of fact, if you look up the definition, it's part of what our Constitution contains.
Liberal is even dirtier, right?
Yeah, it has to do with liberty, my goodness.
Then, would you say that, from a political standpoint and an economical standpoint, that we're using our human nature to political advantage to create an economic diversity, kind of, between the groups?
We are using, for me, I don't know if anybody else wants to speak, but we are using old hatreds and misunderstanding and stereotypes and fear to keep that fear, that stereotype going. Somebody said that we can't deal with, I think Jenny did, we can't deal with our country's history. What does America sell more than anything else?
Capitalism.
It's capitalism, but it sells an image of itself, right? That everybody can make it. Freedom for all. You can come from, no matter what background you come from, you can succeed in America.
The American dream.
The American dream. Our justice system is the best in the world. You know, there's all these superlatives that we sell as Americans, and so we can't afford to look at our history of what we've done to blacks or what we've done to Native Americans, because that would belie the story that we've built for generations, you know? So unless we start looking back and really dealing with this thing that we sell that is America is really a myth, we don't have anything else to go on. We'll continue. We will continue that cycle until we can say, you know, really, we're a much more complex country than we want to believe. And no, we're not the best, and we're not the most just system. We've never really had the most just system. We're actually the #1 for for people in prison than any other country. China, even a communist country, we have more people in prison than any country in the world.
And of course, the predominant race in prison is black. My point is that the media, until Americans fight back against the media and its proliferation of negative images, and until black Americans ourselves fight back against the negative imagery, you know, that we accept in rap, and I'm not anti-rap, I'm anti-gangster rap, and that imagery that is given the whole world to view, and that's how they see black people. It's never going to change because the media has control over our image, over our nation's image, over our image, and unfortunately, it feeds itself because we want to be a part of the media. So what do? We propagate the negative images and stereotypes that we know they buy. And that further denigrates black people as a people. It further makes people look at us as the other, and we're segregated and put away. And until we take hold of our own destiny and how we define who we are, I don't see it getting any better.
Anybody else?
Fix it.
Fix it.
She's trying to.
Personally, I think with these talks, we have a chance to really get an inside look into the other. I will just, and I don't usually like to do this because I usually pass the mic to somebody else. But I've been really playing with the notion, and I know racism is a learned behavior, but a minority mindset is also a learned behavior. I came to this country from Jamaica, a country that's predominantly black, where our issues are not one of race, but is one of class. And I went to school in Alabama for 2 years, a new person to this country. And I noticed later when I was doing my graduate work here in New Hampshire, I started to question myself on certain things. I would be in a classroom and my first years here, I said anything I wanted to say. My hands were always up, you know. I was all, you know, a good student, good grades, and all of that. And it never, ever crossed my mind to not answer a question or ask a question in a classroom. It just never did. No matter how silly it was or how intellectual it was, I'd raise my hands and I'd ask a question or answer a question. And in my grad program, I was saying, Jerry, why aren't you asking a question? Why aren't you answering a question? And I noticed, I started just doing my own internal dialogue. Before I'd raise my hands, I would ask myself 10 questions. Well, am I going to be saying something that's representing all black people? Am I going to be saying something that they're going to think is silly? Am I going to be saying something that, and you go through this list of questions in your head way before you even raise your hand to ask one question. And I said, what was that? And then what brought it all home to me, the last thing was walking on the street one day and a young man was passing me with a hood over his head. And I was like, you know, scared. I'm going, what? You know, if it's a black person, then they're just like you. Why are you scared? And I'm going, why am I reacting to just a hood? And you go through all that thing, and I'm going, everything I've seen, everything I know, ever since I no longer feel and being aware of what racism is in a country, makes me afraid of that person there. Because he's black, he doesn't belong here, maybe he's coming through from somewhere else, and maybe he's going to do harm. So at that moment, it was just that moment for me that said, oh my God, I'm a minority.
So like racism.
It was funny. You laugh. It was really, and said, oh my God, I'm scared of my own people.
May I say? Only my thought about what you just said. I've often thought that any kind of racism is like an illness, and it can be contagious. And that's what I heard you just say, that the contagion of racism can spread just by being in the same environment as racists. And I'm not saying you're a racist. I'm not saying.
I think it's deliberate, because what made me that way? It was fear. It was the images that I saw. It's the desire to separate yourself from the people that they say are like this. You know, well, I'm not that. I'm somebody else. Where it was learned over time. I've been here for 35 years, and believe you me, actually, not until I discovered 10 years ago that Harriet Wilson, that New Hampshire had black history. I was not involved in anything. I was raising my kids and going to work. And that's it. I was never involved in anything until I realized that there was a history here, there was a connection. Because I instantly became a part of the state, the community. There was roots there to explore. Oh my goodness, somebody did this, somebody who looked like me did this in this place where they say we never existed? It totally changed how I view the state. In one instant, totally. Because no, I belonged here. You know, the idea that I didn't belong was, okay, you guys can do what you want. I'm going to go to school. I'm raising my kids. They're going to get their A's. They're going to get their best college degree they can get, and they're going to leave here. No connection. it's that stepping point. But once you realize that you have a connection, that there are roots here, there's stories here, there's stories to bring out, and then once you see the injustice of it all, you're called to action. That's my story.
Yeah.
And that was her doing.
May I just say, I think I might have, didn't explain what I was trying to say. I didn't mean to say or imply that racism becomes ingrained within us, but it becomes a habit. That's all I was trying to say. It can be a habit.
It is true. It becomes ingrained, the way we act and
Well, I don't mean
react.
ingrained.
It does.
You don't take it deeply within yourself, but it becomes like a habit of behavior. That's all.
Yeah, it does.
I want to say you learn the fear,
Yes.
not necessarily for whatever. I mean, I don't think of myself as a racist person, but when you were talking about certain images or certain kinds of people, it seems when I think about what brings out fear in me, it seems as much about class, not so much about color, but they're involved together. And that.
I think if you were born and raised in this country, regardless of your color, you were born with racism. It's in the environment, it's in all of it's all around us in subtle ways, it's in the language. Our vice president, in one of his first public comments about this young black senator, who is now our president, how did he describe him? Anybody remember? He's a nice, clean guy. He didn't mean anything bad. That's just
something good, but
yeah, but that's the way we are all raised to think and to talk here.
And then eloquent is another.
What's that?
Articulate.
Yes.
But I mean, I think we definitely learned the who, because like some of those things when I was hearing them based on the environment I grew up in. And I was not thinking of blacks, I was thinking of Hispanics and the stereotype. But we learned the who. We learned the who and we learned the what to be afraid of. You know, I mean, there's some people who grew up poor and they're learning to be afraid of people with money. Or people who grow up with money and they're learning to be afraid of people who are poor. So class and race and ethnicity.
Yeah. There's a book out there, if any of you have read it, how the white became, how the Irish became white. You know, that's an excellent book on racism in this country that really turns down to skin color. And the other book I'll throw out for you to read is Dog Whistle Politics. That's about the coded words that we're using now. That's still totally, and the whole political environment of how we use race for political gains, really.
Well, let's call it Fox News. I still want to understand how the majority of Americans watch Fox News. And as long as they continue to do that, we'll never get anywhere.
But it goes beyond Fox News, because we have our students, we have in our schools, we don't teach our students to think for themselves. Everybody will, if you ask a question, they have sound bites that they'll answer. They don't know what it means. We don't go beyond, teaching just one history or one story, to our students. There's always just one, the majority narrative that's told. So it excludes all the stories. I was looking at a web page. I was doing something on citizenship, what it takes to be an American citizen, and I was looking at a government web page some months ago from the federal government, and it said that all Americans who came here came willingly. They came from countries such as Ireland, England, China, and Italy. And they came here because they wanted to be good citizens of the country. I mean, that was the opening line. And that, it was written for, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. And we indoctrinate that history, that story to our children from birth. So when we come to adults, all those stories are already told, with who we are, that myth of who America is.
Because it's even standardized testing. That's what schools are based off of now.
And keeping that American story alive, because that's where our power is, in that belief that we're number one. So,
I'm sorry, what did you say?
It's about that a lot of what school is now, in the school systems now, it's based on standardized testing and standardized assessments.
Right.
The teachers are often, teaching to the test, exactly. And so teachers are essentially forced to, even if they don't agree with this doctrine, that's what they have to teach because that's what's on the test.
Let's hear from a teacher.
1 second, this young man had it, and then come back to you.
I just wanted to ask about the views that people have about the role of the state in the struggle against racism, because after the Civil Rights Act and a number of different things, it seemed to be cast as this, it's the strong federal government versus provincial racism. And I'm just wondering if people thinking from when we're talking about economics and things like that, do things like the Civil Rights Act and things like that, which certainly create a lot of progress for Black Americans all across this country, are they ultimately concessions that in some way or other do allow racism to continue? Because we've been talking about these problems that we have with the media and things like that.
I have an opinion about that. Having worked for the federal government for 11 years as an attorney, the federal government needs to exist. It has to exist. Because we cannot leave states to do things to their own devices. How do you say, leave them up to their own devices? There are just too many instances in every single state of the union where provincial people, it can be Sacramento, California, have power and they use it for their own narrow interests. So I thank God for the federal government. Does the federal government have problems? Yes. I mean, too many to enumerate. But I thank God for the federal government. And when I see things that happen even to this day, I've not been in the government for, almost 15 years, but I'm still like, at least there's a government. There's a government. At least they'll take care of it. I don't know if the government's going to take care of it anymore, though.
Right, that's the question, and that's what I'm wondering is, like, if we cannot count on the state to protect people because of all the competing interests, would it possibly be more effective for people to engage in activities that were more subversive and worked outside of the political system?
Yes.
Well, it might be more effective if you can do it, but that's what was happening with the civil rights movement.
Exactly.
But that's not the only thing that was happening. Everybody wasn't engaged in, there was a whole lot of people sitting at home watching this thing happen on TV. But, so I think a lot of things have to happen, and some of it goes in cycles, and we can get into a whole philosophical argument about where it's going and where it's going to end. But, and I certainly don't know. I just wanted to share something that I think might be helpful to the conversation, which I heard recently. An older woman who was, I'm an older woman, a woman of my age, who had been actively involved in the civil rights movement in the South. And she said, we were fighting for equality. What we got was integration. And there have been some problems with that, too. Black communities that were thriving and doing very well were busted from that. And we have an example right here in Kittery Point of a guest house. Now, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing for her, but it was an example of what happened to a thriving business that after 1964, there was no longer a need for a summer guest house for African-American travelers, because African-American travelers after 1964 could go wherever they wanted to. They didn't have to go to that particular place. So then what, you know? But so there, anyway, that's all I'm saying.
I had a quick question. I'm just wondering, as a sociology student, and I know that CNN did this a couple of years back as a test to bring the experiment back, but the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment, where they divided the kids up in the class randomly, well, not randomly, by blue or brown eyes, and one day the brown eyes would be discriminated against, another day the blue eyes. And I know that there was a lot of outcry because the kids didn't like how they felt, and the parents didn't like that the kids learned what it was like. I often think that that would be a way, you know, issues and all the difficulties, to still be trying to teach people that wouldn't normally have the opportunity to experience just a smidgen of what it is like to be able to feel what it was like. And I wonder whether you guys think that would ever be a possibility of stuff being taught in the schools again.
The blue-eye, brown-eye experiment was done by a teacher, and I forgot her name. Do you remember that?
It was a while ago.
Do you know Nate?
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the one.
Yeah, I've read about that.
Yeah, I know it's used a lot in social justice training. We've done it at UNH in a lot of our social justice training classes. There was an experiment for an integrated class on race that was done at UNH when I was there. It didn't continue, but where all the freshmen had to take this class. We did that for a year, and the blue-eye, brown-eye experiment was part of it. So I know we do have it there, and it's a great great experiment for people to experience what it means to be discriminated against. And it was the very same technique that was used in Germany against the Jews, you know, by putting the Star of David, right? Right, would differentiate you, and means that you were treated differently because you had that. And actually before that, in Salem, Salem, Mass, with the A, right? So it's a technique where humans have used all along to segregate and disenfranchise a certain group of people from another. Can I just have Nate say something, and then I'll come back to you, because he had his hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking about Colleen's comment a couple minutes ago about the test scores, and I think where we're going when we talk about how people get marginalized through the U.S. government and stuff like that. And it's just the way that people get objectified. Like when we talk about the blue eyes, brown eyes, I think true to what other folks were saying before, just that it's been a part of the country since it started. To say, like, if you weren't white, if you didn't own land, then you were something else, and we were going to tell you how it was going to be. And it's just too bad that's the case, but I do really value the conversation as it's gone so far, and it's been a real pleasure to hear everybody's perspective. So thank you, everybody who spoke.
Yeah, I'm just getting from that person.
I just want to appreciate the group here on featuring history, because it goes beyond blue eyes and brown eyes when one whole group of people is enslaved. And then you don't tell the story of enslaving a group of people.
Right.
You tell the story about exceptionalism.
Right.
You're the greatest country in the world. I really appreciate those comments, and I think it took me 56 years of my life to finally see a movie that told me what slavery was like. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, a formative act of a culture, and it's the first time I actually look at it or see it. I mean, that makes no sense at all, except that this is a history not to be told.
Well,
and it's not to be told to people like me.
How-
So we can believe our little exceptionalism.
Exactly. How was it that the U.S. was able to rise to become a world power so fast? Faster than any other nation in the whole history of the world. If you had a company where you didn't have to pay anybody to do any work for you, your company would be the biggest, richest company in the world in no time.
My name's John Thompson. I live over in Elliott, Maine. I have an idea, based upon what you just said about that experiment. Well, I've never heard about the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment, but if someone wants to understand what it's like to have racism directed in your direction, hitchhike from here to Washington, D.C. Be fortunate enough to have a ride with a black sharecropper from South Carolina in his farm truck. Go into a diner in Delaware, sit at the counter, you and your white roommate, when I was in art school, and a black sharecropper, and be ignored. Be ignored, as though we didn't exist. Become invisible, and then you might have an idea about one of the ways that racism affects people that it's directed toward. I had that experience, and I'll never forget that experience.
Oh, my name is Robert Stiefel, and I apologize if I came across as sputtering earlier, but I periodically just get so angry and upset, partially because I've been teaching history and literature for 50 years and just retired. And I know that this has happened twice before in our history, and the students I taught didn't know anything about it. They didn't know what caused the Great Depression or what it was. They didn't realize that the 1% were the 1% in 1927, 28, and that the same thing happened in 1875 to 1895, and that each time it was brought about by a group coming together, a whole bunch of groups coming together who were angry, and suffragettes, women pulling for women's rights, and the unions coming together and letting their people being mowed down in the streets by good American citizens shooting them down because they were National Guard or whatever. Things, in one sense, don't change. But what I just wanted to add to this, as I was listening to you all, is how do we organize yes, you know, just within the last couple of days, every woman in this room was told she's only worth about 2/3 to 3/4 of a male. Because every single member of the House of Representatives was Republican, voted against equality in pay. It was that issue that you brought up that was so important. It's not integration, it's equality. It's not special privileges for gay and lesbian people, it's just the ability to marry the person you love. And I thought of all the school districts were disrupted because of the busing systems. Equality is what we seek and what we were promised, so to speak, in our Constitution. But we seem to undermine our own efforts over and over again.
Nate?
Oh, I was just motioning to you that I think
we're almost out of time. Okay, so last questions, and this has been a riveting conversation.
It's not a question, it's a comment to the gentleman who talked about the subversive approach to change. I do believe that the youth, the Occupy movement, is changing our society. And I think we as older Americans need to understand the use of technology and how that's going to change a lot. I would wager that, 50, 60 years from now, we're not going to have the electoral college, and it's going to be, voting on the internet. That's going to be a leveling factor. And I think the subversiveness that you were talking about, it isn't from back in the day when, we had white rifles. I think it's a different subversiveness. It is an ability to affect those people in power by going somehow underneath them, forcing them to move up and aside.
Right, but what about removing them in the first place?
Right.
Well, that's been threatened already. There's already been cases of that where the government has been hacked into by anonymous movements, media groups that are like, listen, we're going to tear you apart brick by brick from the inside if you don't do what we say.
And I believe they saved the election. I believe that Anonymous did change the election. If you go on the internet, just Google, did Anonymous?
They saved Ohio.
Saved Ohio, that's right. I do believe Anonymous did that. We have, at this, you know, there's an element that we do not understand. And this one world government that everyone's afraid of, the internet is going to make it one world government because that's how people are communicating now.
But again, there's got to be access. There's got to be access, you know, libraries, schools, etc.
Look at they've released actual graphs of how much of the internet is actually available to the general public, and most of it is not. And most 90% of what we look at is censored. We can't see anything vital pertaining to any. A lot of it's just force fed to us. We don't get a lot of what's actually going on over there.
One thing that I think is quite interesting is the dissemination of news information via Twitter in real time.
Oh, yeah.
Because that has really changed a
Well,
lot. It's getting to the point where something happens, and I don't go to the regular news, whether it is a nor'easter or what happened in Boston or what's going on
real-time
wherever.
information.
Yeah,
So
I go to
changing.
Twitter because it's you get the news there.
Yeah, but you keep saying the
Literally
news,
inside
and I think we have to even redefine what is the news.
I'm talking about-
Because the traditional resources say that the journalists are providing the investigative reporting and so forth that provides us with the news, and yet you both are telling me that it's the youth movement, which is also what you're talking about,
But even more
that's changing things, and I don't think any of us in this room have a clue about what that future is going to be because they don't know.
The regular news organizations are finally acknowledging that they're getting their tips from Twitter, from people who are actually tweeting it out in the real moment on scene.
But then you can use Twitter to pass lies along too.
You can.
Yeah, but so does Portsmouth Herald.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we can continue this dialogue as we have a little snacks back there. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements before somebody said that, you know, one of our guests said that he doesn't want to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Bill. I'll tell you what we're going to be doing. We're going to have a civil rights rally commemorating the signing of the Civil Rights Bill, and we'll invite civic organizations that are working on issues right now, the death penalty, the fair housing, all of them, equal pay, the Transgender Act. There are quite a number of civil rights issues that are in our state right now. We'll have a rally day for the whole group just to mention what these issues are. So that's how we plan to do that on
Subversive group,
on July 2nd. On May 3rd, you have the handout for our spring symposium, which will take a look at the coloring of law and punishment. Part of it will be on our death penalty. We'll talk about that. And on June 19th, we'll be having we'll celebrate June 19th by returning to Rock Rest, which is used to be the bed and breakfast for African Americans at the time during segregation. We'll have, it'll be our fundraiser for the African Burying Ground Memorial. So stay tuned if you want information on that. Just make sure you sign in. And
3 things. I wanted to let you guys know that we are now on social media. Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail is available on many different areas. Your favorite social media content. I passed out lists, yes, and a few more to be added. That's one thing. I brought in some from my dad's collection of the era for the civil rights movement, for what was going on in the rest of the United States. I do have 2 books from the New England area. Please feel free to look at them. Please don't take them. They're my collection. And the last thing is, I am looking for people in this crowd who were in New Hampshire during the civil rights movement to give me little 5-minute video impression clips that I would like to record so I can put them up on YouTube for the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail to support this dialogue today, to kind of get more of people's actual memories from the time period. Because I think it's really important, because New Hampshire's not talked about too much. There's a lot of history up there. So I'd like to do that in the crowd afterwards if anybody wants to participate.
Do your name?
Were you really?
I was indeed.